Welcome back, everybody. This is week 3 of our vlog series on clinical trial reimbursement. Glad you are joining us again. Um, Last week, we talked about the strategic decisions that have to get made in IDE reimbursement, how to bill, when to bill, if to bill, all of those heavy questions. So in this video, and we talked about that a lot from the perspective of Medicare and Medicare Advantage. We really wanted to have Dr. Stemple weigh in as the former Humana medical director on how commercial payers view clinical trial reimbursement. So I am going to turn it over to Dr. Stemple and to Carla to ask some questions of Dr. Stemple on just how we should be thinking about this and how we should be counseling companies around these issues. So thank you both.
Thank you, Kim. I'm really excited for this topic because I think it's one that I am with the majority of. I want to hear the answers from Dr. Stemple. It's the black box where there's less known than there's more known. So appreciate the opportunity. Dr. Stemple, when thinking about commercial plans, how does a commercial payer in particular view clinical trial reimbursement? Do they want to pay for clinical trials? All non-parts?
Well, it's the black box, and I'm not allowed to reveal that secret.
So end of video.
All right.
I think the whole world appreciates clinical trials. Obviously, we need clinical trials to validate, a pharma device intervention. We really need to have clinical trials to understand. Otherwise, how does medicine evolve and how do we progress? So I would say any commercial health plan wants to cover a well-designed, clinical trial. The big question is always, is this clinical trial really going to add to the knowledge of medicine or, the care of individuals or answer a question? So we really want the clinical trial, and, they all have to be NIH approved, and, I think most health plans will have a clinical trials coverage policy. And basically, it just needs to be well understood, well defined, clear criteria, approved by NIH or other regulatory agency. And assuming all those things are met, yes, we have no issue with covering clinical trials, but we do expect the company providing, the drug, the device, or the intervention, that part of the clinical trial is going to be reimbursed by the manufacturer, and we're not going to cover that experimental piece because until they do the study, right? The purpose of the study is to define the benefit of this intervention or this device or this technology. So until that study is done and we find that this intervention device brings value, clinical value, that's when it becomes standard of care, and that's when it gets reimbursed by health plans. But as long as it's under the, provisions of a clinical trial, very akin to Medicare, we're going to cover the routine costs that patient would incur. But any cost that we can say clearly tied to the clinical trial, and a very typical one is, particularly in the pharma world or device world, if you have to do frequent imaging and other things that normally wouldn't be part of the care that person needed, those services then are sort of carved out and billed or expected to be billed by the investigator or the entity doing the study. And the issue, I think we might have mentioned it last week, my apologies, but really even understanding that the patient's in a clinical trial, because you can imagine we get the request for a service, and unless the physician or the company clearly identifies we're enrolling the patient in the clinical trial, we honestly may not know if they're using standard codes, standard coding. There is some sense that we may not even understand that the patient's even enrolled in a clinical trial. So I think the manufacturers coming to us, and I think, Carla, you said, if we understand there's a clinical trial and we clearly believe, enrolling people in clinical trials is a good thing. And like I said, that's how medicine progresses and evolves. But we would really want the manufacturer to let us know, oh, this is a clinical trial, here's what we're going to afford, or here's where we feel our obligation starts and ends, so that there's clarity when that claim comes in that, oh, this part of the claim we can sort of quote ignore because it's under the auspices of the manufacturer to cover those costs. So
Thanks.
sort of long-winded, but hopefully that made sense at some end of the day.
No, that does make sense.
Carla,
It makes
can I
me-
jump in for just a second? I'm sorry, because
No,
I'm sorry. It just sparked a question for me that you just brought up, which is, for CMS, companies can go in and meet with them and say, here's how we're designing the study and here's what we think is routine care, yes or no. What is the best way for companies to do that with commercial payers? How would you have appreciated that as the medical director of Humana at the time?
Send me the study and the protocol.
Okay.
Obviously it'd have to go through your IRB and who's supporting the study, and clarity about what is the end game, so to speak, of the study. So the goal of this study is to take this population, and it's not unlike unmet needs. So we're bringing this device, product, whatever, to market because we feel it's going to provide this service. And then if they do, and Carla and Joe's companies, if they have the set protocol, if they have the codes that they're going to use, if they have clarity around this is what we believe is our responsibility, and the rest of the services. So as much clarity as they can add to that initial request for approval of the services being rendered, that makes the health plan medical director's life much simpler. And we
Great.
can agree or disagree, but if we have aligned incentives before that study even begins, then life goes forward somewhat in a more smooth pattern.
Thank you.
And do you think, is it better for the health plans to receive that information from the manufacturer / sponsor, or from the physician that's going to be providing the service in your network, or
never the physician, because the physician's not part of the reimbursement. I mean, this physician's going to be paid for his services, but the device or whatever that's part of the investigational part, that needs to come from the manufacturer, because the physician can say, I believe, whatever, but there has to be true agreement with the manufacturer, because they're going to be the ones who will be covering those investigational costs. So I would want the manufacturer to lay out, a simple spreadsheet. Here's the procedure. Here's what's new or different. Here's the device. Here's the codes that we're going to be submitting, so on and so forth. And as I said, the better and cleaner they can make that, then when that claim comes in, it's an easy process, because we sort of have a pre-agreed upon process for that claim to be adjudicated.
From the manufacturer's standpoint, is it that clear who they would provide that to? Because if you think about the entirety of the process, they're submitting an ID, they're going through the ethics boards and IRBs, they're in site selection process, and each site could be under a different plan. From the manufacturer's side, how would they know how to navigate or who to contact? Because I would imagine it could be a multitude of people in this process.
Exactly. And I would say the place to start, if they know within a health plan, anyone in the claims paying or provider network, because if they send it to me, I'm going to send it to the claims people to say, here's a potential claim that's going to be coming in. You, the claims folks, need to be aware of it. However you're going to identify that claim. So to your point, there's multiple inputs where a manufacturer could go, but at the end of the day, it's the claim shop that's going to be adjudicating that claim as it comes in. So as best as they can identify someone within the claim shop and make them aware of that claim. And then what would typically happen if it went to provider network, or say a market-based medical director, they would send it into the claims team or send it to the medical director of policy to look it over, validate the trial, validate the procedure being done, validate it's appropriate, because ultimately it's going to come under the medical director of clinical policy to say, is this a well-done, validated clinical study that we should be approving and reimbursing for.
When I was on the other side of this, Joe, what typically I would think about doing is, depending on where the sites were, maybe identify the site's top 5 payers and just preemptively send something saying, hey, we're going to be in a study. Here's all the stuff that Dr. Stemple asked for,
Right.
and you may be receiving claims.
Yeah, and most of the time, not if that medical director's been at an entity at United, Humana, Aetna for a period of time, a lot of the manufacturers know how to contact that medical director policy person, and that's always, to me, a good point of entry, because then that medical director in the policy world knows where's the best venue to then take the next step. So that could go to provider, it can go to contracting, because do we need to have a contract, because we've never had a contract with this manufacturer before. So that clinical trial could be disseminated to multiple different places, just so everyone's aligned and the processes are in place to appropriately adjudicate that claim when it comes in. And if they're a major company, I think they generally have those contacts within the health plans, or most health plans today. If you go to their websites, they do have like a place to submit questions or concerns or inquiries. So if they don't have a contact at the health plan, I would say, as you said, go to the top 5 payers that might be involved and go to their website. And most payers will have a website where anyone can generally submit an inquiry. And if they didn't know where to go, that would be my best first step to try to figure out who to contact, how to contact them, and get the relationship set up to establish the protocol for that clinical trial.
Would you, following on that, some of the websites also say for medical policy, would we go there and do that email? And that's another good place to start. Okay.
Yeah, because remember, as the medical policy lead, that person or someone else within the policy world has to say, is that clinical trial meet the criteria, that the study protocol, the number of sites, who signed off, the IRB. So that's why I say the policy is probably the first place to say, oh, are we going to cover the routine care in this clinical trial? And then that starts the downstream processes of getting everything in place to allow that clinical trial to move forward.
And in our experience, partnering with the sites does help that process as well, because from the manufacturer's side, they may be a little isolated to that. So when we build the feasibility questionnaire and the site selection process with our sites, we really do try to engage them on who are the insurers that you're going to submit these claims to, so that we could start to get a sense of that as well. And it's a lot of the local ethics boards. Some of these will have a local ethics committee that does the approval of the project, so that it helps to kind of legitimize, that this is research that has been approved through ID, through the ethics board, safe for patients to be tested, things like that.
Yeah. And to your point, as much support or, committee sign off that they've achieved, obviously that makes the policy person's job easy, because they can see the IRB, the ethics committee, whoever has signed off on that trial. So therefore, no reason to investigate if it's a good trial, appropriate trial, because all the committees have done the administrative work and signed off on it. So it does move things along much quicker.
We think about it from that standpoint. So now we know how to get it paid for, or parts of it paid for. If we're going to do that, have we now set the manufacturer up to potentially be on the radar screen of the payer to have a negative policy? So if you're not billing, you're kind of in this, don't ask, nobody knows you're there. Now we start to bill, might have a category 3 or an unlisted code, raising the level of scrutiny. Does that ever trigger a non-coverage policy?
Well, it triggers a monitoring process. So I know this technology is out there being tested, and most health plans will have we called it Emerging Technology Committee. So we had our 2-year forward-looking group that would look at what's new potentially coming to the marketplace. And to your point, we might highlight something and say, we're not so sure about this one. We need to put a red flag around it and really watch the development. And absolutely, bring whatever data we could get on a monthly or quarterly basis. Because if we had concerns or we just weren't quite clear about the potential population, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, so if we knew something new coming to market, particularly totally new, neurostimulation is, the hot thing. So wherever different neuromodulation devices and how they're being used, et cetera. So yes, that 1000% gets on our radar screen because we want to be ahead of those claims if it should succeed, if it should get approved, but we still have maybe some concerns. We want to be able to be ahead with the policy, defining the appropriate population, so on and so forth. So if we can have that policy built when that technology comes to market, yes, we're one step ahead of waiting for the claims and then, oh my God, are we covering this, not covering this? What are we doing with this now that it's in the marketplace and FDA approved, et cetera?
Makes sense. That I might have to add that to one more check of caution on maybe why not to build in a clinical trial from week 2. But I really appreciate that insight.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, Kim. Yeah, and even for the company, they have their clinical trial, they have their protocol. Obviously, they have the clinical trial design. I call it the sort of accompanying white paper, the 3-pager. Yeah, because the clinical trial sometimes gets into too much detail, and by page 3, I'm done. So the other suggestion to a company is put together the 1 or 2-pager that really highlights the key elements for the intervention. What's it expected to deliver, the potential population, what do they think the prevalence might be. Because those are the kinds of things that I'll want to know once we're actually trying to build a policy around appropriate population, prevalence, condition, identification, so on and so forth. So if they can put together, I call it a simple dossier of, the clinical trial will have a lot of that information, but the 2-pager introductory sort of letter always helps.
Yeah, okay. And I'd say it typically is in a clinical studies protocol as a synopsis. So it would be the study criteria, the endpoints, the general population of who's in, who's not. And that's probably a nice summary without getting into the fine details.
Exactly.
Yep. Yeah, you answered my question.
I guess my last question is, how does the pricing in the study impact future pricing for a device from a commercial plan perspective?
Well, yes. So you assume the company has done their due diligence. You assume the company has established what they believe is a fair market value or price. So yes, so there, to your point, the red alarm, if we something coming in and we're seeing suggested pricing might be whatever. If they give us a potential price point during the clinical trial discussions, it sort of tells us how they're going to price it once it comes to full commercialization, and that obviously helps us to plan. Oh, is this going to have a major impact, minor impact? Is this really going to be a cost driver? Do we really need to look at this? So I think as they are pricing the device during the clinical trials, and if we have insight into that, we would assume that pricing is going to carry over once that product comes to full commercialization.
Great discussion. Really appreciate your input, Dr. Stemple. So that is a wrap for this week, and we'll look forward to seeing everybody next week. Joe and I are both going to talk about what are some of the best practices around actually supporting the sites if they do decide to bill in the study, and how to potentially appeal cases if they get denied going forward. So we'll enjoy that conversation next week, and thanks for being here.
Thank you.
You.
Thanks.
Thank you.